Thank you, Mail, and thank you, Niaz, for inviting me to talk on a very important aspects, which really deals with the Indo-Pacific and how it is being seen from the lens of Southeast Asia, and what exactly will be the template, what exactly will be the blueprint for future, and how Southeast Asia as a region will look into it, and whether there will be certain changes or what exactly will be the position of the ASEAN members, given the fact that Vietnam is now the chair of ASEAN, and it has its own take with regard to Indo-Pacific. Now, if you look into this thing, this whole traction, this whole debate with regard to ASEAN came into being when ASEAN released its outlook statement with regard to Indo-Pacific. If you read very thoroughly into the statement itself, it puts ASEAN-led mechanisms into the center and also talks about Indo-Pacific as not an area of rivalry, but of cooperation and working out on some tangible areas which can be beneficial for all the countries in the region itself. Now, also it also highlights that the in Asia Pacific and Indian Ocean are contiguous zones and territorial spaces, and it's an integrated and interconnected region, which technically means they are taking this whole region with a pinch of salt. But incidentally, it was also Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, which proposed this whole concept of Indo-Pacific Treaty. And at that point of time, the foreign minister of Indonesia, Marty Natalegawa, was at the helm of affairs, and he said, we can really work on this. And thereafter, you find Australia, Indonesia working on it. Subsequent to it, Indonesia being the one of the largest nations in Southeast Asia, also talked about global maritime fulcrum, which means will be the fusion point of the two basic regions, Indian Ocean and Pacific region. But within Indonesia, there is a whole lot of talk which is going on that whether global maritime fulcrum is dead or it still has some life left in it. Now, if you look into Indo-Pacific and this whole debate which is going within the Southeast Asia under the ASEAN rubric, it says that it should be for development and prosperity and all those things. If you look into the historical past of Southeast Asia itself and the three community that it has really proposed for it, political security, economic and socio-cultural community, you will be surprised to know that in terms of economic community, they are doing much more than in respect to political security or socio-cultural community per se as such, which technically means Southeast Asia nations look into economic aspect much more sincerely and seriously. And for that, China is still a very important partner because most of the Southeast Asian countries are the back office ancillary units for China's major regional value chain. And this we have seen that whenever there is talk with regard to giving more opening, more liberalization for imports from Southeast Asia, there is always the question of rules of origin, and India has been very reluctant to really open it with regard to certain aspects of this non-tariff barriers with regard to Southeast Asia. Now coming more to the contemporary domain and how it is really being seen into it, ASEAN again and again says that it wants to strengthen the East Asia Summit, it wants to strengthen ASEAN Regional Forum, and which has been always been talked about as a talk shop itself. When this whole question of ASEAN, and the Quad Plus also comes into being, technically we see some remnants of the East Asia Summit sneaking into it, which means technically the two dialogue partners also getting into it, primarily Korea and New Zealand, and Vietnam being one of the votaries, one of the more vocal proponents with regard to Indo-Pacific, even though it doesn't use the term very specifically as Indo-Pacific, it says Indo-Asia Pacific, technically fusing the two regions once again together. And therefore, there is a lot of churning which is going on within the Southeast Asia, that how we are going to really look into this whole concept of Indo-Pacific. Now, if you want to really look into their thinking, their understanding on this fact, that let me tell you also that in one of those ASEAN meetings, China proposed a treaty which is known as Good Neighborliness Treaty, which means if you accept and abide by the Beijing dictates, we might be really sparing you some with regard to your concerns with regard to security, and Beijing will technically become by default the security guarantor for most of the Southeast Asia, which is a very far-fetched vision that China is selling in this region itself, given its indulgence in South China Sea and all across the region also as such. Now, if you look into Southeast Asia, it is using this Indo-Pacific as, yes, there is an option, but it is hesitant and it's unsure of the marginal utility. I stress the word marginal utility of the Indo-Pacific, that if we are going to really go by the Indo-Pacific, what exactly is there for us? Indo-Pacific has certain structural flaws, and I want to really highlight those facts into it. It is a vision, of course, it is a fusion of the two maritime zones, Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean, which is very good for security, for maritime and anti-piracy missions as such. But it really is not, giving that option of economic integration across region, be it the South Asia, Southeast Asia, or the larger Pacific region. So economics aspect of Indo-Pacific is missing, even though there has been a paper which has been published by the USAID, which talks about how this fusion of Southern and Southeast Asian countries will bring some semblance, some understanding, and also propose some benefits to the Southeast Asian countries. Now, if you look into it, the TPP, US have withdrawn from this whole concept itself. Otherwise, TPP would have given some leeway with regard to the markets, which might be opening up for the Southeast Asian countries. If you look into the recovery rate of the ASEAN countries per se as such, the old ASEAN 4, which means Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia, are still to come to be the post-COVID-19 economic resurgence. While on the other hand, the new ASEAN, which includes Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar, are slowly waking up and reinventing their whole economic aspects. And they might be the bigger what is called who will wake up much faster than the older ASEAN per se as such. Now, in this regard, again, this whole economic aspect will be dividing the two ASEANs into different zones of development and growth. Now, also, this whole question of South China Sea, which have been talked about by Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay and Dr. Rajaram Panda itself, whether South China Sea will be a deal breaker or deal maker as such. Is it a vision or is it a mirage when this whole Indo-Pacific construct really comes into and provides that necessary structural support, operational support to it? There has been also talks about the freedom of navigations and FONOPS as such in the South China Sea, and it has been done very recently in January, and subsequently also in the last year when group sail and other activities were undertaken as such. But also you look into how this code of conduct with regard to the South China Sea is likely to shape up in near future. I don't see that commitment from China which is coming, which means everybody is unsure about how the post-COVID world will shape up and how China will react to this whole construct, which is likely to germinate as such. Incidentally, what is very interesting, that even though there have been differences among the Southeast Asian nations on the South China Sea, but Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam have come together and supported each other with regard to the demarcation of the continental shelf representation in the UN itself. Indonesia also extended the letter of support, which means somewhere down the line, the fissures within the ASEAN are getting dissolved because of this initiative per se as such. There has been talk with regard to Quad 2 and possibilities and all those things. Let me highlight few of the facts which are really coming to the ground. The thing is that the Quad 2.0 is getting bound by 2 and 3 structural support mechanisms, which looks very promising. The first is that most of the countries under the Quad are coming into under the MOU, which is known as the Encrypted Military Communication agreement as such, which means they can share information and intelligence without any hindrance. The second aspect is that when these Quad 2.0 countries are looking into it, they are looking into different challenges that they are facing. The only problem is that the Quad 2.0 are not coming on a common ground, because if you look into the Philippines statement that they made, everybody has its own take with regard to their regional concerns, which shows some dissonance, some divergence on certain matters itself as such. Australian PM will be coming over on the 4th of June itself. There will be, summit meeting in this regard. Again, there is a logistic agreement which is likely to be signed itself. So if you look into it, a loose binding is already happening among the Quad 2.0 members, and this can be the precursor to much more better engagement. Whether South China Sea will provide the necessary impetus and incentive for Quad to really work together is yet to be seen in this regard. Also, the RCEP itself, if you look into it, and if you look into the volume of trade in 2019 that the China and ASEAN region per se has had, it is more than nearly $600 billion, which shows the volume of trade that the ASEAN and China have at this point of time. And also, you also need to acknowledge this very fact itself. whether this whole COVID vaccine will be a game changer or not. Whosoever jumps and provides the vaccine at the best possible rate to the Southeast Asia, because most of the countries are very heavily tourism dependent, and tourism comprises one of the major components of the GDP in most of the country itself, with the exception of Laos, which is relatively closed economy itself. Also, many people are really saying that, look, the China will again be coming back on this fact that China is very important. But let me tell you, by historical accounts itself, the whole of Southeast Asia have seen anti-Chinese riots. And I won't be surprised if the anti-Chinese riots start once again. We have seen this in Indonesia when there was a blasphemy against the one of the governors of one of the provinces, and he was really castigated, ostracized, and there was a whole lot of hue and cry. But the important aspect is that the Chinese diaspora are also very prominent in this economies, be it the case of Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore, even though Singaporeans don't identify themselves with the mainland China. They said that we are typically from Taiwan. So that is another difference of opinion which might be really existing at that point of time. Now, also, the critical element which you need to really take into account is the resurgence of the economies of Southeast Asia. How they are going to research, and they very well know that if China suffers, they will benefit if the investment comes to their doorstep. The question is whether US and European economies will provide that window, that ventilation point for their economies to seek some reinvention as well as some growth of the economy as such. In this regard, the one critical factor that one needs to really look into it, that how the ASEAN summit meeting, which is being postponed, likely to be held later this year, how it really deciphers and decodes their attitude and their perspective with regard to Indo-Pacific itself as such. Vietnam doesn't want to be seen into the US strategic orbit, and it is very clear with regard to the statement that is being made per se as such. Because when very lately, when there were reports that the Cam Ranh Bay will be offered to US, Vietnam foreign ministry immediately came to the fore and said that we are not going to offer Cam Ranh Bay to the US as such. But then there is an underlining thing which one should really notice, and which might be a tectonic game changer in this context itself. Vietnam and US are supposed to sign the strategic partnership agreement. It's something which has never been seen in the Vietnamese context, because their constitution clearly lists US as an aggressor and as an enemy country. If Vietnam, a country like Vietnam, can change certain strategies depending on their strategic priorities itself, it needs to be seen how others are really going to gang up. Now, coming to the Philippines itself, there is a visiting forces agreement with US, which Philippines said we are going to abrogate it. But then, with regard to mutual defense treaty, they have not raised a voice as such also. The question of ASEAN centrality is going to remain very prominent, very important in this whole discourse itself. But the question is whether Quad members will like to be in the ASEAN orbit and work out their blueprint, their visions with regard to it, is to be seen. What has happened with regard to ASEAN and most of the Southeast Asian countries is that in order to placate China, they have used non-traditional security threats as a discussion point in most of the ASEAN meetings. Now the time has come to address these issues related to security and hardcore security in this regard itself. There has been also talks that Indo-Pacific and BRI. Let me tell you, with regard to if you audit the BRI projects in most of the countries, I'm not sure almost all the countries, but most of the countries, the projects have been truncated, the funding support and the requirements have been reduced. Because if you see the case of Thailand, you see the case of Malaysia, even Indonesia is re-examining these BRI projects and is reducing substantially. In fact, few of the projects in Malaysia have been reduced. Thailand has reduced the long railway, which was seen to connect few important economic centers and export promotion zones. So they are taking all these with a pinch of salt. Now, in the last, and I would like to conclude with this fact itself, is Indo-Pacific seeing a very bright future, or China will take over and will be the main security guarantor in this aspect? There are very intense socio-cultural dynamics which also play in Southeast Asia, and we have seen whenever there is some Chinese aggression in South China Sea, we have seen protest in Vietnam, which is still a very close society with regard to protest and demonstrations. In the past also, we have seen anti-China riots, And in the present also, we need to see how the political dispensation in most of the Southeast Asian countries looks into the Indo-Pacific. So far, I will say that Indo-Pacific is not down the drain. It will again emerge because that is the only option that most of the Southeast Asian countries have. How they really treat this concept and whether they subscribe to it is to be seen in the new economic dynamics which will emerge in the post-COVID-19 phase. Thank you very much.